He thought a waitress was too powerless to matter. What he didn't know was that the only creature in the room who saw the truth was already watching him. People walked into rooms looking for someone smaller than themselves. Ethan slowly stood from his chair. The movement drew attention from neighboring tables. Several guests turned their heads. Others pretended not to watch while listening closely. Jasmine felt every eye in the room beginning to drift toward them. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" Ethan asked. His voice wasn't loud yet. Somehow that made it worse. Jasmine glanced at the small drop of coffee near his sleeve. Barely visible. "I'm very sorry, sir. Let me have that cleaned immediately." Ethan stared at her. Then, without warning, he lifted the cup from the table and tipped its contents toward her uniform. Gasps rippled through the room. Jasmine froze. The warmth soaked into the front of her apron. Conversations died. Silverware stopped clinking. For a moment, all she could hear was her own heartbeat. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Ethan sat back down as though nothing unusual had happened. A faint smile touched his lips. Around the restaurant, guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some looked away. Others watched openly. Jasmine lowered her eyes and gripped the edge of her tray, fighting the humiliation threatening to overwhelm her. Then something unexpected happened. Across the room, near a quiet corner booth, a large Belgian Malinois slowly rose to its feet. The dog's ears lifted. Its gaze locked onto Ethan Harrington and never moved. And beside the dog, a sharply dressed Korean man quietly set down his coffee cup. The room hadn't noticed him yet, but Shadow had. Jasmine Brooks had spent most of her life learning how to disappear. It was a skill nobody taught her, yet somehow she had mastered it before she turned 18. Growing up in a small apartment in Brooklyn, she learned that bills arrived whether families were ready or not. She learned that hospital visits could erase months of savings. Most importantly, she learned that people treated you differently when they believed your struggles made you less important. As the dining room remained frozen around her, those lessons returned with painful clarity. She stood perfectly still, coffee staining the front of her uniform while dozens of strangers watched. Not one of them knew that she had worked a double shift the night before. Not one of them knew she had spent her lunch break arguing with an insurance company about her mother's treatment. To them, she was simply a waitress standing beside a wealthy customer. And in situations like that, people usually decided who deserved sympathy before hearing a single word. Jasmine lowered her eyes and forced herself to breathe. One breath in, one breath out. If she cried, she would give Ethan Harrington exactly what he wanted. Across the restaurant, several guests quietly returned to their conversations, relieved that the uncomfortable moment appeared to be ending. Others continued watching with curiosity. They were not concerned. They were entertained. That realization hurt more than the coffee soaking through her apron. "Clean that up," Ethan said casually, as if speaking to someone whose feelings did not exist. Jasmine nodded once. "Yes, sir." Her voice remained calm. Years of customer service had trained her well. She reached for a nearby linen cloth and carefully began wiping the small puddle from the edge of the table. Every movement felt heavier than usual. Nearby, a young couple exchanged glances. An older businessman shook his head slightly, but said nothing. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody objected. Silence was easier. Silence was safer. Near the hostess station, restaurant manager Richard Palmer finally emerged from his office. Jasmine felt a brief spark of hope. Richard had supervised her for nearly 3 years. He knew her work ethic. He knew she never caused problems. Surely he would say something. Surely he would remind everyone that respect worked both ways. Instead, Richard walked directly to the table and offered Ethan an apologetic smile. "Mr. Harrington, I am terribly sorry for the inconvenience." Jasmine felt something sink inside her chest. Richard never looked at her. Not once. Ethan leaned back comfortably. "Train your staff better." "Of course, sir," Richard replied immediately. Jasmine stared at the floor. The message was clear. The billionaire mattered. The waitress did not. Yet while everyone focused on Ethan, nobody noticed the quiet man seated in the corner booth. Daniel Kong had not touched his coffee since the incident. His dark eyes remained fixed on the scene unfolding before him. Beside him, Shadow stood motionless. The Belgian Malinois had received years of specialized training. He ignored loud noises. He ignored crowds. He ignored distractions. Yet now the dog remained unusually alert. Daniel noticed it immediately. Shadow rarely paid attention to ordinary disagreements. But something about this situation had captured the animal's full focus. The dog watched Jasmine carefully as she worked to clean the table, watched the trembling fingers she tried to hide, watched the way she apologized despite being the one humiliated. Daniel followed Shadow's gaze and studied the young waitress for the first time. Most people saw an employee. Shadow seemed to see something else entirely. And Daniel had learned long ago that ignoring Shadow's instincts was usually a mistake. The dog did not sit back down. Jasmine finished wiping the table and stepped back, hoping the ordeal was finally over. She should have known better. People like Ethan Harrington rarely stopped once they discovered an audience. The billionaire glanced around the dining room and noticed what Jasmine had already seen. Nearly everyone was paying attention. Some pretended to study their menus. Others stared openly. The room had become a stage, and Ethan clearly enjoyed being at the center of it. He adjusted the cuff of his expensive suit and leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile. Actually, he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, I think there is still a problem. Jasmine froze. Richard Palmer immediately stepped closer. What seems to be the issue, sir? Ethan pointed toward the front of Jasmine's uniform. She looks unprofessional. Customers should not have to look at stained clothing while they eat. A few uncomfortable chuckles emerged from nearby tables. Jasmine felt heat rise into her face. The stain existed because of Ethan himself, and everyone knew it. Yet nobody challenged him. Richard cleared his throat. Jasmine, perhaps you should step into the back and change. Jasmine glanced toward the service hallway. The problem was that she did not have another uniform available. Her spare had torn the previous week, and replacing it had to wait until after her mother's next medical bill was paid. She opened her mouth to explain, but stopped herself. Experience had taught her that explanations rarely mattered when powerful people had already decided the outcome. I can finish my section first, she said quietly. Ethan laughed. Not a genuine laugh. The kind people used when they wanted others to join them. Finish your section? He repeated. That is confidence. More nervous laughter followed from a nearby table. Jasmine looked down. Every second felt heavier than the last. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to walk out the front door and never come back. But rent was due in 8 days. Her mother's treatment was scheduled for Friday. Real life had a way of making pride expensive. Across the room, Daniel Kong watched without saying a word. Most people assumed silence meant indifference. In Daniel's world, silence usually meant observation. He studied details others missed. The way Jasmine kept apologizing despite receiving none herself. The way Richard sided with the customer before hearing both sides. The way Ethan seemed energized by attention rather than embarrassed by it. Beside him, Shadow remained standing. The dog's eyes never left Jasmine. A young server carrying a tray approached her cautiously. Are you okay? He whispered. Jasmine forced a small smile. I will be fine. The young man nodded and moved away, but his concern did not go unnoticed. Shadow watched that interaction carefully as well. Then something unexpected happened. Jasmine bent slightly to pick up a fallen linen napkin from the floor. The movement revealed a small photograph tucked inside the clear plastic holder attached to her apron. It was old and slightly worn. A picture of Jasmine standing beside an older woman with a bright smile. Her mother. Daniel noticed it immediately. So did Shadow. The dog tilted his head. For the first time since the incident began, Daniel saw genuine emotion cross Jasmine's face. Not embarrassment. Not fear. Determination. She touched the photograph briefly before returning it to place. A simple gesture, yet it explained everything. She was enduring this for someone else. Ethan never noticed. He was too busy enjoying the sound of his own voice. But Daniel did. And as Shadow continued watching the young waitress with unwavering focus, Daniel found himself paying closer attention than he originally intended. Something about this woman refused to leave the dog's mind. And now, it was beginning to occupy his as well. Daniel Kong had built his reputation by noticing what other people ignored. In boardrooms, that instinct made him wealthy. In more dangerous corners of life, it had kept him alive. Tonight, it was Shadow who had noticed first. The Belgian Malinois remained perfectly still beside the booth, yet every muscle in the dog's body communicated the same message. Pay attention. Daniel rested one hand lightly on the leather seat and studied the room again. Most guests had returned to their meals. Crystal glasses reflected the warm chandelier light. Servers moved carefully between tables. On the surface, The restaurant had recovered from the uncomfortable scene. But Daniel knew better. Humiliation did not disappear simply because people looked away from it. Across the dining room, Jasmine continued working. She delivered meals, refilled water glasses, offered polite smiles. She behaved exactly as a professional server should. Yet Daniel noticed the slight stiffness in her movements. He noticed how she avoided looking toward table 12. He noticed how she kept one hand near the photograph attached to her apron whenever she thought nobody was watching. Shadow noticed too. The dog finally took a single step forward before stopping again. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" he murmured quietly in Korean. Shadow's ears twitched. No response, of course. But after 4 years together, Daniel trusted the animal's judgment more than he trusted most people. Nearby, Ethan Harrington continued entertaining his guests. His voice carried across the room every few minutes. Confident, loud, certain that everyone wanted to hear him. Daniel had met hundreds of men exactly like him. Men who mistook status for character. Men who believed respect could be purchased the same way they purchased watches, cars, and penthouses. Then something unexpected happened. A busboy carrying a tray of clean plates accidentally bumped into Jasmine while passing through a narrow aisle. The young employee immediately apologized. His face turned pale with embarrassment. Before Jasmine could even respond, Ethan laughed from across the room, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Careful," he called out. "Looks like incompetence is contagious around here." A few people smiled awkwardly. Others looked down at their plates. The young busboy froze. Jasmine immediately stepped between him and the attention. "It was not his fault," she said calmly. "The aisle is crowded." The busboy stared at her in surprise. She had every reason to let him take the blame. Instead, she protected him. Daniel leaned back slightly. Interesting. Most people under pressure focused only on themselves. Jasmine seemed incapable of doing that. She absorbed embarrassment that belonged to others. She shielded people even when nobody shielded her. Shadow suddenly sat down for the first time all evening. But his eyes never left Jasmine. Daniel noticed the change immediately. The dog had made a decision. Whatever he had been evaluating, he was now certain. Daniel looked toward the waitress again. For several seconds, he simply watched her helping another employee recover from an awkward mistake. Then a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was the first smile he had shown all night. Across the room, Jasmine had no idea that 2 sets of eyes remained fixed on her. One belonged to a man whose influence reached far beyond Manhattan. The other belonged to a dog that almost never judged people incorrectly. And both of them had reached the same conclusion. Jasmine believed the night could not become more uncomfortable. She was wrong. The dinner rush intensified as new guests filled the restaurant. Orders arrived faster. Servers moved quicker. The dining room buzzed with conversation again. But beneath the polished atmosphere, tension remained. It lingered like a storm cloud nobody could quite see. Jasmine focused on her work. One table at a time. One order at a time. That was how she survived difficult days. Keep moving. Keep smiling. Keep going. Across the room, Ethan Harrington seemed increasingly determined to remind everyone of his presence. Every few minutes, his laughter rose above the crowd. Every story became louder than the last. Several guests nodded politely, while clearly wishing to return to their meals. Yet Ethan continued, feeding on attention the way some people fed on applause. Then a hostess approached his table carrying a reservation tablet. She leaned down and quietly explained that another high-profile guest had arrived unexpectedly. The restaurant needed one additional table in the VIP section. It was a simple logistical issue. Nothing more. But Ethan immediately frowned. "Then move someone else," he said. "My guests are comfortable." The hostess maintained her professional smile. "Sir, we are trying to accommodate everyone." Ethan sighed dramatically and waved a dismissive hand. "That sounds like management's problem." The young hostess nodded and stepped away. Jasmine noticed the exchange while delivering drinks nearby. So did Daniel. What happened next surprised nobody who had been watching Ethan all evening. The billionaire spotted Jasmine passing through the dining room and called out loudly, "You, come here." Several conversations paused again. Jasmine approached the table. "How may I help you, sir?" Ethan leaned back and gestured toward the crowded room. "Tell me something. Does this place always struggle to organize itself, or is tonight a special occasion?" A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Jasmine knew the question was unfair. He was asking her to criticize her own workplace in front of customers. "The restaurant is doing its best to serve everyone, sir," she answered carefully. Ethan smirked. That was not an answer. Jasmine remained silent. She had learned long ago that some traps were disguised as questions. Across the room, Daniel noticed Shadow stand once again. Not abruptly, not aggressively, simply rising to all fours and watching. The dog's attention had sharpened. Daniel followed his gaze. Ethan was not merely complaining anymore. He was searching for opportunities to embarrass someone, and Jasmine remained his preferred target. "Interesting," Daniel murmured quietly. Shadow's ears lifted. At that exact moment, a nearby elderly customer accidentally dropped a fork. Before any employee could react, Jasmine stepped away from Ethan's table, retrieved the utensil, reassured the embarrassed guest with a warm smile, and requested a clean replacement. The entire interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet Daniel noticed something remarkable. Jasmine treated the elderly woman with more kindness than she had received all evening. No frustration, no resentment, no bitterness, just dignity. Shadow sat beside Daniel again, his tail resting quietly against the floor. The dog seemed completely certain now. Daniel looked toward Jasmine and then toward Ethan. One person spent the evening elevating everyone around her. The other spent it reducing people whenever possible. The contrast could not have been clearer, and for the first time since entering the restaurant, Daniel began to consider whether remaining a silent observer was still the right choice. Daniel Kong had not expected a memory to find him in the middle of a Manhattan restaurant. Yet as he watched Jasmine move through the dining room, a face from decades ago appeared in his mind with startling clarity. His mother. He remembered her standing behind the counter of a small grocery store in Los Angeles after immigrating from Korea with almost nothing. He remembered the long hours, the exhaustion hidden behind polite smiles, the customers who treated her with kindness, and the few who treated her as though her dignity depended on their approval. Daniel had been 12 years old when he first noticed how unfairly the world could judge people who served others. His mother never complained. She simply worked harder. She helped neighbors who had less than she did. She brought food to elderly residents in their apartment building. She treated every person with respect regardless of status. Watching Jasmine tonight felt strangely familiar. The same quiet resilience. The same refusal to let bitterness take root. The same habit of protecting others, even while carrying burdens nobody else could see. Across the restaurant, Jasmine delivered another order and thanked a customer who barely acknowledged her presence. She smiled anyway. Daniel found himself wondering how many difficult days she had survived before arriving at this one. Shadow rested beside the booth, but the dog's attention remained fixed on her. Daniel reached down and gently scratched behind the Malinois's ear. "You see it too, do you not?" he said softly. Shadow blinked once. That was answer enough. Meanwhile, Ethan Harrington seemed determined to continue performing for his audience. One of his guests mentioned an upcoming charity gala, and Ethan immediately launched into a lengthy story about donations, influence, and exclusive invitations. He spoke about generosity the way some people spoke about investments. Everything sounded transactional. Daniel listened for less than a minute before losing interest. Character revealed itself through actions, not speeches. Then another small moment caught his attention. A young dishwasher emerged briefly from the kitchen carrying supplies. The teenager looked nervous, clearly new to the job. As he passed through a service doorway, he dropped a stack of folded napkins. Several landed across the floor. The young man's face immediately turned red with embarrassment. "It away." Jasmine possessed those qualities. Ethan did not. For several seconds, Daniel said nothing. Then his phone vibrated against the table. A message appeared from one of his executives regarding a billion-dollar project waiting for his approval. Daniel glanced at the screen, locked it again, and returned his attention to the dining room. For the first time all evening, the business matter felt less important than what was unfolding in front of him. And when Shadow slowly rose to his feet once more, Daniel realized something had changed. The dog was no longer simply observing. He was waiting. The moment arrived so quietly that most people in the restaurant did not notice it at first. Jasmine certainly did not. She was busy delivering desserts to a family celebrating a birthday near the windows. The children smiled when she placed the plates in front of them. Their parents thanked her warmly. For a brief moment, the tension of the evening faded. Then she heard Ethan Harrington's voice again. "Excuse me," he called across the dining room. The familiar knot returned to her stomach. Several guests looked up immediately. Jasmine turned and walked toward table 12. Every step felt heavier than the last. "How may I help you, sir?" she asked. Ethan tapped his empty water glass. "This has been empty for nearly 5 minutes." Jasmine glanced at the glass. She had refilled it less than 60 seconds earlier. Everyone at the table knew it. Ethan knew it too, yet he maintained a perfectly serious expression. "I apologize," Jasmine replied. "I will bring fresh water right away." Ethan smiled faintly. "You do that?" The guests seated with him exchanged awkward glances. Even they seemed uncomfortable now. The performance was becoming difficult to ignore. Jasmine turned to leave. Before she could take 2 steps, a calm voice interrupted the room. "That will not be necessary." The words were not loud. Yet somehow every conversation stopped. Jasmine froze. Ethan looked up. Richard Palmer looked up. Half the restaurant looked up. Daniel Kong had risen from his booth. The movement alone seemed to change the atmosphere. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored. His expression remained calm. Beside him, Shadow stood quietly at his side. The Belgian Malinois did not bark, did not growl, did not move. Yet dozens of eyes drifted toward the dog before returning to the man holding the leash. Ethan frowned. "Excuse me." Daniel stepped forward at an unhurried pace. "I said that will not be necessary." Jasmine stared in confusion. She had never spoken to this customer before. She did not even know his name. Yet something about his presence commanded attention without demanding it. Daniel stopped several feet from the table. "The waitress has fulfilled her responsibilities all evening," he said. "The issue appears to be elsewhere." Silence spread across the dining room. Ethan laughed once. "And who exactly are you?" Several guests visibly stiffened. One businessman near the bar nearly dropped his glass. Another customer whispered something to his wife. Recognition was spreading. Slowly, quietly, like a ripple moving across water. Daniel looked at Ethan for several seconds before answering. "My name is Daniel Kong." The billionaire's expression did not change. The name meant nothing to him, but it clearly meant something to others. Richard Palmer suddenly looked as though all the color had drained from his face. The businessman near the bar stared openly now. Even a few staff members exchanged nervous glances. Jasmine noticed the reaction immediately. So did Ethan. For the first time all evening, uncertainty flickered across his features. Daniel remained perfectly composed. Shadow sat beside him without taking his eyes off the table. Then an older customer near the center of the restaurant quietly spoke words that carried farther than he intended. "That is Daniel Kong." The room fell completely silent. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire restaurant. Ethan Harrington glanced around the room, searching for confirmation that this interruption meant nothing. Instead, he found something he had not expected. Recognition. The businessman near the bar was no longer pretending to ignore the situation. Several guests had quietly reached for their phones. Even Richard Palmer looked as though he wished he could disappear. Ethan forced a laugh. "Should I know who you are?" he asked. Daniel Kong remained calm. "That is not the important question." Ethan's smile weakened slightly. Daniel looked toward Jasmine. For the first time all evening, someone in the room appeared more interested in her well-being than in Ethan's opinion. "How long have you worked here?" Daniel asked. Jasmine blinked in surprise. "Almost 3 years, sir." Daniel nodded. "And have you always conducted yourself this professionally?" Richard answered before she could. "Absolutely. Jasmine is one of our most reliable employees." The words seemed to leave his mouth reluctantly. Daniel's eyes shifted toward the manager. "Interesting. Because for the past hour, I have watched a reliable employee accept blame, embarrassment, and disrespect without receiving support from the people responsible for providing it." Nobody spoke. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The truth carried enough weight on its own. Ethan crossed his arms. "You are making a very dramatic issue out of restaurant service." Daniel turned toward him. "No, I am making an issue out of character." The room grew even quieter. Shadow sat perfectly still beside him, watching. Daniel continued. "A person's character becomes visible when they interact with someone who has less power than they do. That is when the truth appears." Ethan's jaw tightened. Several of his own guests avoided eye contact. Daniel reached into his jacket and removed a phone. He tapped the screen once before placing it on the table. "I invested in this restaurant group 6 years ago," he said. Richard's eyes widened immediately. Ethan's expression changed. "What?" Daniel looked toward the manager. If I remember correctly, Hawthorne and Reed is owned by Meridian Hospitality. Richard swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Daniel nodded. And Meridian Hospitality is partially owned by Kong Global Holdings. The room seemed to exhale all at once. Ethan stared at him. For the first time that evening, genuine uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Daniel continued speaking with the same calm tone. I do not involve myself in daily operations. I trust people to do their jobs. Tonight, however, I happened to witness how one employee was treated. Richard looked physically uncomfortable now. Several customers exchanged stunned glances. Jasmine stood frozen beside the table, struggling to understand what was happening. Daniel picked up his phone and opened a photograph. It was a picture of his mother standing inside a small grocery store decades earlier. He studied it briefly before looking back up. My mother spent her life serving customers. She taught me something important. Never measure a person's worth by the uniform they wear. Ethan had no response. Daniel slid the phone back into his pocket and looked toward Jasmine once more. Then Shadow slowly rose to his feet and moved closer to her side. The dog sat beside her calmly, as though he had chosen exactly where he belonged. And for the first time all night, the entire restaurant seemed to realize who had earned respect and who had merely demanded it. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire restaurant seemed suspended in a moment that felt larger than any of them. Jasmine looked down at Shadow, sitting calmly beside her. The Belgian Malinois rested quietly against her leg, as if offering reassurance without asking permission. She had spent the entire evening feeling invisible. Now, for the first time, she felt seen. Ethan Harrington shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone. Around him, guests no longer watched with amusement. They watched with understanding. The story had changed. Daniel Kong looked toward Richard Palmer. A business succeeds because of people like her, he said calmly. Not because of people who believe respect only travels upward. Richard lowered his eyes. You are right, sir. Daniel nodded once. Then remember it. The manager turned toward Jasmine. His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Jasmine, I owe you an apology. I should have supported you immediately. Jasmine blinked in surprise. Throughout 3 years at the restaurant, she had never heard Richard admit a mistake. Thank you, she said softly. Nearby, several employees exchanged relieved glances. The young busboy Jasmine had defended earlier smiled openly. Even the hostess looked as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Daniel then looked toward Ethan. There was no anger in his expression. Somehow that made the moment more powerful. Money gives people options, he said. Character gives people value. The two are not the same thing. Ethan stared at the table. For the first time all evening, he had nothing to say. Daniel did not wait for a response. He simply turned away. The lesson had already been delivered. The dining room slowly returned to life. Conversations resumed. Glasses clinked softly. The tension that had hung over the restaurant finally began to fade. Yet something had changed. Guests who had ignored Jasmine earlier now thanked her by name. One elderly woman squeezed her hand and wished her mother well after overhearing part of the conversation. Another customer left a generous tip with a note that read, "Never let anyone make you forget your worth." Jasmine carefully folded the note and placed it beside the photograph of her mother. An hour later, her shift finally ended. The restaurant lights seemed softer now. As she gathered her belongings near the employee entrance, she heard footsteps behind her. Daniel stood there with Shadow at his side. "How is your mother doing?" he asked. Jasmine smiled sadly. "Some days are better than others." Daniel nodded. Then he handed her a business card. "If you ever need help navigating medical resources, call that number. Someone will answer." Jasmine looked down at the card, speechless. "Why would you do that for me?" Daniel glanced toward Shadow. A faint smile appeared. "Because sometimes the right thing becomes obvious." Shadow gently nudged Jasmine's hand with his nose. She laughed through unexpected tears. For the first time that evening, they were not tears of humiliation. They were tears of relief. As Daniel and Shadow walked toward the waiting town car outside, Jasmine watched them disappear into the Manhattan night. The city remained as busy as ever. The traffic still moved. The lights still shined. Yet something inside her had changed. She would remember this night for the rest of her life. Not because a wealthy man had embarrassed her in public, but because another man had reminded an entire room that dignity is not something granted by power. It belongs to every person who carries it. And that night, everyone in Hawthorne and Reed remembered what dignity looks like.